Fort Snelling, one of Minnesota's first historical landmarks, one of the state's first military outposts, a symbol of America's imperialism, and a site of attempted cultural genocide. Prior to the signing of 1805 treaty, the area we now know as Minnesota was occupied by the Dakota tribe of Indians.
Our ancient homeland is Minnesota Makoche, land where the waters reflect the heavens or skies.
And Bdote is the sacred place where the waters meet, the Minnesota River and the Mississippi River. That is the center of our universe, our Hochoka, the creation of our people.
The Dakota were nomadic people who moved between 3 locations for supplies and shelter according to the seasons. This migratory pattern continued uninterrupted for thousands of years until white settlers started to arrive in Minnesota in the early 1800s.
The Treaty of 1805, it was negotiated by Zebulon Pike.
The Treaty of 1805 was supposed to guarantee that the Dakota had a place to live and that the U.S. provided payment. In return, the settlers were allowed to build an unassailable fort in a strategic location to control the Minnesota River and outlying area. They called it Fort St. Anthony, later changed to Fort Snelling.
Well, it's a strategic location, 2 rivers, but it's in the heart of Dakota Territory at that time in Minnesota.
The whole purpose of a fort is to establish domination in a region. It's about subduing whatever hostile populations might live there. It's about maintaining control over the economy, so controlling the supply of goods and resources and the flow, to controlling who gets wealthy from the exploitation of those resources, and about protecting the populations you want to protect.
See, and at this particular time, the British government, the British fur traders were still in Minnesota because the boundary between the British colony, which became Canada, and the United States was not agreed upon yet. And that happened many years later.
Like there was 3 articles to that treaty. The first treaty was to establish a fort. The second treaty was what is called consideration or payment for the lands. And by the way, we were never paid for these lands. And thirdly, it guaranteed that we could do all things as we had formerly done in said district. Means to live here, fish here, hunt here, conduct ceremonies, have access to our sacred sites, protect our burial mound, all of the things that are connected with living a daily life.
Later treaties were supposed to ensure further payments for the Dakota. Unfortunately, the due payments were often not made on time or at all. With the arrival of settlers came the immobilization of the Dakota people. They were confined to relatively small areas of banks of the Minnesota River.
First, they made some really bad deals for the Dakota people where they took away their land base, and then the things that they were promised, the Dakota people were never delivered, and the people were struggling and starving.
These missed or late payments put the Dakota in a very tough position. Without the payments, the Dakota couldn't effectively trade for supplies, and the inability to move around in the seasons made it nearly impossible for them to be self-sufficient. The Dakota's desperation led to a stressing of their relationship with the U.S. government. These tensions eventually boiled over in a violent dispute over eggs.
Usually the incident that is attributed to the beginning of the war is an incident over eggs, when there were 4 warriors who went to one of the white farms in the area, and they were starving, and they had been out hunting, but they came across this farm. And in an account that my grandmother told, she talked about how they went into this, they could smell bread baking, and because they were starving, that bread smelled so good and drew them to the farm, and the woman was there, And they asked her for some bread, and she refused. She turned them down. And they were angered by that here their people were starving, and she's baking bread. She's occupying Dakota land, and she wouldn't share. And so one of the warriors saw some eggs that were in a pantry there, and he said, I'm going to take some eggs. And so he started to put those in his pouch, and the woman saw that, and she started screaming at him, you can't take the eggs, and pretty soon her husband came in running from the fields. And the Dakota warriors ended up killing 5 white settlers in Acton as a result of that experience. And they knew that those killings would not go unpunished by white society. And so they had a choice at the time. Either the men could surrender and receive a punishment, or they could use it to launch the war, to say, we have had enough. Our people are starving, we're desperate, and we aren't going to take any more.
Operating primarily out of the Fort Snelling, the U.S. Army stopped the Dakota resistance. Of the many Dakota that died in the war, only 300 were actually accounted for. After the fighting, many Dakota were interned in a concentration camp, right under the guns of Fort Snelling.
I had a great-great-grandmother who was imprisoned on this land where Fort Snelling overlooks this land. So I learned that my great-great-grandmother was one of the forced marched people that was called a death march from Lower Sioux, Morton, Minnesota to Fort Snelling, to the concentration camp. And it was a very sad story.
The Dakota were kept in that camp over the winter. Conditions were extremely harsh, and many died as a result of disease, the weather, and violence.
We know that there were diseases that were rampant, that were going through. The people suffered illness. People didn't have adequate shelter, adequate clothing, adequate blankets, and so the exposure took its toll on the population. They didn't have good food, and so you have the combination of bodies being weakened because of starvation or because of not having enough to eat, and then succumbing to disease and exposure. We know that some of the girls from the concentration camp were pulled out and raped. They would be found with their throats slit, with their faces buried in the sand around here. We estimate that about 300 of our people were killed at this site as a consequence of their imprisonment here. And to this day, one of the injustices is we still don't know what happened to their bodies. We don't know where the bodies are. We don't know what happened to them.
Abraham Lincoln and Governor Ramsey personally ordered that 40 of them be executed and used the extermination of the Dakota as a deterrent to any further uprising. These victims were walked to Mankato to be hung.
The largest mass execution in U.S. history, and I know that it was handled in a very expeditious manner, where they just kind of had one lined up, and then the next one, then the next one, and then they just went through, and you're guilty, you're guilty, you're guilty. And I think there was no due process that was taken into account for Indian people. We didn't have any fair representation. There was language barriers. There was a lot of injustice that happened with that.
Additionally, 2 Dakota chiefs who had escaped from Canada were hung from a tower on Fort Snelling.
The 2 men who were hanged, not with the 38 in Mankato in 1862, but were hanged on November 11th, 1865, were Medicine Bottle and Shock Pit. And those 2 leaders were part of the group that fled at the end of the war. People had a choice of either surrendering or fleeing, trying to escape. And so many escaped westward, others escaped up into Canada, and they were part of the group that went up into Canada.
Nowadays, Fort St. Helens is recognized as a military base in the Civil War and an outpost where white settlers traded and worked diplomatically with Native Americans. You will hear no mention of the attempted cultural genocide committed against the Dakota people there.
Most Minnesotans don't know at all what happened. Who wants to say that we came here by genocide and ethnic cleansing? You can't be here in a good way by hiding a harm. It's better, it's more healing, it's more healthy to look at it and talk about it and then say, okay, what can we do to be here in a good way?
Governor Alexander Ramsey was one of the founders of the Minnesota Historical Society. That is the same Governor Alexander Ramsey who called for the extermination of Dakota people in 1862.
He said it to the legislature on September 9th, 1862, to Minnesota's legislature, that the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. So he also was the founder of the Minnesota Historical Society. So I think there's an interest in not telling a history that is so shameful.
It's still a place that they draw tourists to have fun, to have picnics. In the summer, they offer Little House at the Big Fort day camps. Children can have their birthday parties there. You can bring your friends and you can relive your Laura Ingalls Wilder fantasies. And that's all celebratory. And you can't have two stories that are told simultaneously at a site like that. You can't celebrate children's birthday parties in one part of the fort and then over here say, oh, but wasn't that genocide thing bad? Wasn't that awful?
Additionally, the only part remaining of the original establishment is the tower from which Shakopee and Minnesota were hung. The rest of the fort has been rebuilt using millions of dollars from the Minnesota Historical Society. This has been the cause of some upset amongst the Native American community in Minnesota. There has been many marches from the fort to Mankato to commemorate the 30A and several take down the fort rallies.
And when we do this Dakota March, we commemorate what our ancestor had gone through. And we come here to this sacred area and put these prayer stakes down with the prayer, with the tobacco offering to honor our ancestors and to plant seeds of cultural resilience and the stories to our children. That this can't just be of suffering, but to develop resilience, and to hear them personal stories that link us to our ancestors, that creates our spiritual foundation of our identity, our language, our culture, our kinships.
Many see Fort St. Helens as a symbol of American imperialism and want nothing more than to see it crumble. Others believe that it should remain where it is and converted into a concentration camp or a genocide museum for the Dakota. Much like the Nazi concentration camp Auschwitz, they all want to see the land return to the Dakota ownership.
That's a really hard question because there's the thought that if they take down the fort, people would forget about the history and what truly happened to the Dakota people. So there's that teaching may be lost or even forgotten about. So then there's that. But I think if they leave the fort, they should teach the true meaning of why they built the fort. You know, what's the fort doing here in Indian Territory? Why did they come here? Those kind of questions should be asked and should be answered. And the eventual reason is that they wanted this place.
I believe that Fort Snelling should be torn down. I believe that it should be given back to the land, to the sacred, above anybody else, above what people want or think that we should do with it. I think it gives us a freedom in our soul to see that Fort Snelling be torn down. I would like to see it crumble down. I would like to be there to see that visual. So then I know that in my heart, that gives me a sense of freedom that this state is holding nothing over me anymore.